paradox of the English language in that we use the word depressed to describe how a person feels when BYU loses a football game, and to describe how a person feels 10 seconds before he commits suicide. We often confuse depression with sadness, but depression is not simply having a bad hair day or even finding out that Michael Scott is leaving the office. Because depression is a neurological disorder of the brain that impairs a person's ability to function. I'm embarrassed to admit that there was a time when I actually wondered if a person with depression was maybe just a little bit weak, lazy, or selfish. That is because there's a serious stigma in our society towards people with mental illnesses and depression. I would like to talk about 3 major myths that I believe contribute to this negative stigma. The first myth is that people with depression need to try harder. However, it has been proven that people with depression have a dramatic reduction of brain activity during their depressed episodes. There is a malfunction in the neurotransmitters that allow for the natural flow of dopamine and serotonin in a person's brain, both of which are essential chemicals for well-being. Quite simply, people with depression have a chemical imbalance that usually cannot be fixed by willpower alone. The second myth, so the opposite of depression, is simply happiness. I believe this myth occasionally leads us to downplay the severity of depression. You may ask, but isn't it normal to feel depression at certain points in our lives? And I would respond that the range of human emotions is an extremely valuable asset. But emotion is adaptive, and depression is maladaptive. Depression is a crippling feeling of despair that impairs a person's ability to function. Being depressed is about as close to being dead as a person can get. The third myth is that depression is a form of weakness. Last October, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland said, "Mental illnesses are some of the realities of this mortal life, and there should be no more shame in acknowledging them than in acknowledging a battle with high blood pressure or the sudden appearance of a malignant tumor." I had the opportunity to volunteer at the Utah State Hospital for Mental Health, and it was here that I met Tommy. Tommy's about 25 years old, and he's wearing a Chicago Bulls hat without fail every time I see him. My first interaction with Tommy, I asked him if he saw the last game. He shook his head no. This turned into a weekly conversation of me telling Tommy some of the stats and highlights from games of the previous week. But Tommy is so depressed that he can't even look me in the eyes. And I began to become a little bit disheartened that after several weeks, Tommy had still never said a single word to me. One afternoon, however, as I was sitting across from Tommy, he suddenly looked up. He had tears in his eyes, and he simply said, "Thank you." Such a simple gesture, yet it pierced me to the core. Because for a brief moment, I was able to sense so much of the torment going on inside this other human being. Tommy craved human connection, but his depression had figuratively decapitated him to the point where he was incapable of communicating. Tommy longed for someone to understand him, but his illness had robbed him of the ability to physically speak. Tommy was desperate to be healed. Now, in that moment, the lesson learned rang loud and clear to me, which is the message I want to share with you today. Depression is not a choice. It is a disease. My passion for this topic goes even deeper than my relationship with Tommy. About 3 years ago, I found myself suddenly debilitated by depression. And in that moment, I myself believed these very myths, which led me to be too ashamed to admit and accept what I thought at the time was a weakness. But as I have since reflected on my own experience, on the experiences of others like Tommy, and on the research behind depression, I stand convinced that depression is nothing to be ashamed of. We will never be able to break down the stigmas in society if we wait for society to do it for us. Change starts with individuals. It starts with each of us. So I ask you to stand up for those with mental illnesses and depression. Rather than believing the myths, let us believe the truth. That first, people with depression do not need to try harder. They need us to try harder to understand what they are going through. Second, the opposite of depression is not simply happiness, it is vitality. And third, Depression is not a weakness of character. It is a weakness of chemistry. If we continue to believe these myths about depression, we will isolate the very people who need our love the most. Someone you know is suffering with depression right now. I want you to feel the same way about that person as you would feel about them if you found out that they had cancer. Because depression is not a choice, it is a disease. Thank you.